Welcome to History Sleuth, a podcast exploring the involvement of history and culture in current events. My name is Adelaide, and for today's episode, I interviewed my history major advisor, Sarah Olzawski, over Zoom about her work investigating genealogy. But before we get into that, if you're on Twitter, follow me at Sleuth History to get updates about when I post new episodes and be part of the community. Make sure to also follow History Sleuth on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, let's learn about genealogy.
All right. Hello, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Adelaide. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so do you mind telling my audience just like a little bit about yourself and your experience with genealogy?
Yeah, so I was a history major here at OU, and so that's probably where all of this originated for me. But I've been interested in my family history for as long as I can remember. I remember there were some family documents and some family histories that got passed down. And I remember reading those things and being interested in those things as young as like 6 or 7 years old. So, the history BA was definitely a part of it. And then I also went to graduate school for library and information science. And so that's all about researching and using databases and stuff like that. And also genealogy requests. People come to public libraries all the time to do their own genealogy. But my day job, as you know, is I'm the academic advisor for the history department. But I have been working I kind of call myself a semi-professional genealogist since 2014. It's kind of just happened naturally. I started working on my own tree in 2012, or maybe a little bit before that, around then. Just out of curiosity, because again, there were some basic family genealogy stories that I grew up with and I had known for many, many years. And I think one day I was just bored and I was like, let me see what's on Ancestry. And I also had one of my good friends, she was really into it. So she also kind of taught me how to get started on Ancestry.com. So I just started on my own tree in 2012 on working on my dad and my mom's side. And in 2014, word kind of got around that I was doing this, probably because I was talking about it a lot. But my boss at work, Associate Dean Rhonda Kensel, she actually was my first client because she had been working on her uncle's genealogy for a lot of years. And, obviously as a dean, and she's also a professor, she's very busy and she didn't have the time to dedicate to it. And she knew I was doing it as a hobby. So she was like, I will pay you to do mine. And I was like, I thought it sounded incredible to me. I was like, are you kidding me? Somebody is going to pay me to dig around in their family tree and hunt for documents. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how it started. And then from there, it's just been word of mouth that I have a lot of friends who know that I do this and, other parts of my family, like people who are in my family, but I'm not related to by blood, so I've done trees for those types of people. I think I've lost count now. I think I've had like about 14 or 15 paying clients. I have 2 right now. And so the work just kind of comes in spurts. And the fun part about it is I get to learn something new with each tree because every person's family history is so different. It takes me to different countries. I get to get into different types of records. Each tree is kind of like its own puzzle. And I have to learn, like what records even exist for certain countries. And it's really hit or miss. Like some countries have a lot of great records online. And then some types of trees, you just know that like, you're not going to really be able to find anything because of where the countries that are involved or something. So It really varies. So that's been my experience with genealogy so far.
That's really interesting. Oh man. I don't think I knew that you did like other people's trees as well. I'd seen a little bit of your stuff on Twitter with your own family history, but that's really cool. I guess like one of my next questions is how do you go about like building the family trees? What sort of like resources do you look into?
Yeah, so I use Ancestry.com primarily, which anybody can use for free. Anybody can set up their own family tree on Ancestry.com. You just register for an account. But if you want to get access to the records that they have, you have to pay for a subscription. And there are different price level plans for that. But there are also other free sites that you can use that have some records, but not near as much as Ancestry.com. Ancestry.com is kind of definitely the biggest online record hub for genealogy. So if someone wanted to get started, the best thing to do is to start on Ancestry.com and set up a family tree. because one of the most important things with genealogy is staying organized, because it gets very easy to get lost in the records and to not know where you are. So starting with that tree is fundamental. You start with yourself and then just work backwards and start by plugging in as much information as you know yourself, about your parents and your grandparents. That's about as far as most people get. Some people have some knowledge about their great grandparents, but if you have names of people back to about at least like someone who was alive, born by 1940, it's pretty easy to find those records that get you started on that trail. And Ancestry.com is great because you'll fill in your tree and then it will give you hints of what records may be associated with the people in your tree. So it's basically a linked database, and it's constantly searching for records the same way Google kind of works and constantly searching the web for search results. That's how Ancestry.com works. And so it'll give you these little hints with a leaf showing you that we found a record that may match this person in your tree. And then you can look at that record and see what other clues are in that record. And that's how you get back further generations. The most important thing with genealogy, in addition to organization, is number 2, to not copy other people's sourceless trees. There are a lot of bad genealogies out there. People get on Ancestry.com and copy just any old tree that they see, and they assume that it's correct. And if you don't see any records that's associated with that tree, then it's usually not accurate, or you have no way of knowing. And so even when clients come to me, sometimes they'll have, like some information that a grandma collected or something many years ago. And I'll always take that into account, but I always start with my own research and work backwards and then use the family's documents to corroborate what I find. Because especially since there are so many more records available now, it's very easy for genealogies that were published not that long ago to not be completely accurate.
That's so interesting. So what sort of things are they doing like incorrectly when there's like an inaccurate tree?
Wrong people. Yeah.
Really? They're just like finding the totally wrong people?
Yes. Yes. There are trees full of people who are not actually that person's family.
That's so interesting.
Like say your grandfather was John Smith, and so they find a John Smith on the census and they don't think that like, is this my John Smith? And that's where you have to use those context clues to make those deductions, look for the wife with the same name. Do the kids' birth dates and order and name match between this family and your family? So that's where the wrong things happen. And there's just also a lot of myth-based information out there. There's that is definitely a part of my tree. I see that a lot, but mostly it's just copying other people's trees. So I really insist on doing my own research, working backwards, and you have to be very careful each time you go back a generation that like these are the right people. And the way you do that is by collecting lots of different records that verify the same dates and information between those documents.
Okay, that makes sense. So what kinds of things like are the records? Are you finding birth certificates or different things like that? Like what kind of primary sources are they? Is what I'm asking.
Yeah, so it really varies because there's a lot of variables that go into play with this. Because every state does records differently. And then every state also digitizes records differently. There are some states that have great records online, and there are some states that don't have hardly anything online. It really varies. So there are basically, federal documents like the census. Those are usually pretty trustworthy. But the thing with that, in the way the census used to be done, it was somebody just going door to door. That's all it was. So it was self-reported information from whatever that person said to somebody at their door. So maybe not always accurate. And then there was the person writing it down, and maybe they heard wrong or they got confused or distracted and they recorded things incorrectly. So usually the census is accurate. That's kind of like the best thing you can find. The last currently publicly available census is from 1940. The 1950 census, I believe, will be available publicly in 2022. There is a 72-year embargo on census records to protect people's privacy.
Okay.
So it'll be very exciting when the 1950 census is released, because that's
Yes.
a whole other layer of information that you can find out about your ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, census is a great place to start. Birth and death certificates are more commonly available online for older people, people that died longer ago. Somebody, like my birth certificate is not going to be online. My parents' birth certificates aren't going to be online. In some states, like our grandparents' generation, birth certificates might be online, but still very doubtful. But if you're at a dead end in your tree and you're at a place where you have to have a birth certificate, because say you can't figure out who somebody's dad was, and you feel like the only place this information would be on the birth certificate. Even if it's not online, there are sometimes other ways you can get those records by writing the local record keeper, or if you're working with a client, get the client to sign off on that. So those are kind of messy records. There's also for many generations ago, there's a lot of different types of records, like tax records, property records, basically any clue that someone would leave behind in their life as they are moving through a bureaucratic system. Immigration records, so like naturalization documents, immigration documents like ship manifests. So that's how a lot of times how you can find like what ship your ancestor came over if they immigrated from Europe. So those are more common in older records, but for more recent generations, it really is the census and birth and death and marriage licenses that are most helpful. And so like I said, the most recent census is 1940, and the first federal census was 1790. But from 1790 to 1840, they only listed the heads of households' names on census. So on those censuses, there are no named wives or mothers. There are no named children. They would just tally them by age and sex.
Okay.
1850 was the first census where they listed the name and actual age of everybody living in the house. And then, of course, also 1850 and 1860 censuses include slave schedules, is what they were called. It's a separate part of the census. But again, there are no names of enslaved people on those records. The slave schedules only list the person who owned the people, mm-hmm. and then how many people they owned by age and sex. So censuses have changed over the years. There's been and that fits in, how politicized the conversation is right now with the census, and how you can see the questions that we ask on the census are very critical in terms of the types of information we can know in the future about current generations. Because how we counted enslaved people is one example, but there were also different census questions that existed over the years for Native Americans. I think in the 1900 and I think the 1910 census, they asked special questions of Native Americans if you self-identified as that way. And the questions are unbelievably racist. Like they would ask, is this Indian living in a permanent dwelling? Which by 1900 and 1910, most Native Americans were living in fixed dwellings in this country. I've seen those records from my own ancestors, and it's just bizarre to see. Types of information we're collecting and the types of questions we ask about people are really important, because those become the data points that you can then search for in the future.
Yeah. Ooh, that's really interesting. There's so many complicated moving parts, it seems, in all of this. What do you think is or what have you found is the biggest challenge?
Probably those dead ends, brick walls is what we call them in genealogy world, brick walls. Even for, sometimes there's just no good reason, and you just hit a brick wall where you can't find any record that gets you any further back on one line. And that gets really frustrating. And sometimes it can happen for lots of different reasons. Either, those records aren't available online, or they're missing, or somebody, like the census taker got the name wrong, and it's just been indexed wrong all these years, or the person could have disappeared, or who knows what happens. There's really no way to know, and that's not satisfying at all. Because it's very exciting getting back another generation, and then the further back you get, it's very exciting. And when you run into that brick wall, it's very frustrating. And sometimes you can go back to those brick walls because there'll be maybe new records online. It's worth it to go back and look every once in a while.
That is interesting. That would be so unsatisfying.
It is. It's a real bummer. It makes you very angry.
Oh, sad. What have been some of the more like encouraging and exciting things that you found in your research, either for yourself or for a client, if you're able to say?
Yeah, I can speak generally about clients. I had one client who had not one, but two ancestors actually on the Mayflower.
Oh, wow.
Like verified. And, that's one of those myths that a lot of people will say about their family is we were on the Mayflower. And when she told me that, I was like, we'll see. That's always my attitude when people tell me stuff like that about their families. I'm like, we'll see what I find. But I actually was able to prove it and got back that far that they were actually on the Mayflower. And then another aspect of genealogy we haven't talked about yet is the DNA, which is the other part of it. I did have a client discover he had a half sister after that he didn't know about. And since I was managing that test, I got the message, an email, from my client's new half sister, and I had to tell him that information, So that was very exciting. Those have probably been my best. It's always really fun and exciting when you can get back really far. One of the trees I'm working on right now, I got back to about, I think I'm in the 1500s in England. Wow. Yeah, and that happens a lot if you find that there's somebody who, if a family was here during the American Revolution, and if there's lots of records about that family at that time, then usually that means that family was of a higher social class. And what I have found in my research, it would be very interesting to read, like, is there any history on this? And that's my problem all the time. Like, I want to know the backstory. Like, is this a thing? Like, because I see patterns in the trees that I do. And if your family was here in the American Revolution and there's lots of records about that family, there's a good chance that they're connected to nobility in England, because a lot of those colonists were from wealthy families, large wealthy families who had been in the U.S. or in the colonies since, the immigration started. And if you make that jump from the colonies to English nobility, then there's a very good chance you can go very far back, because the nobility genealogy has been chronicled and published for centuries, very well documented. So if you can hook up with that, and that's what's going on with my one client's tree, that's how you get all the way back. And then that's very fun, because then you're talking thousands of ancestors that you've back like 12 or 13 generations.
Crazy. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about, you mentioned DNA earlier. I didn't even think about that, but that would be a new way that's kind of like transforming how genealogy is done. How has that played a role in your work? Like, how have you been a part of that?
Yeah, so it is the big thing right now. And DNA for genealogy, there's basically two parts of it. There's the ethnicity estimate stuff that companies do, but then there's also just the function of DNA matching with relatives, and how, like my client found his half sister, people are doing these tests and finding family that they didn't know about or have lost touch over the years, especially through adoption. The DNA for genealogy is used a lot by adoptees to help find their birth family. That's extremely common. My best friend who kind of taught me how to do genealogy, she is a DNA genealogy expert, and she does that for people. She works with people who were adopted to help them find their birth families. I do not do that really, because that stuff is very science and mathy.
Yes.
You have to look at the percentage of DNA that you share with a match, and then there's ways that you can calculate the likely relationship based on that amount of DNA. I don't have a brain for that at all. So I don't even try to do that. The ethnicity estimate stuff is pretty controversial for good reason, because it's a new science and it's not accurate, of course, at all. And the way it works is that these companies identify basically control groups of people who they've done their tree, and they know, like, say this group of Scottish people, these Scottish families have been in Scotland, we can document it for 1,000 years. And they take those people's DNA, and then they pull those people's DNA and say, what do these people who've been in Scotland for 1,000 years, what do they have in common with their DNA? Whatever they find from that, that's how Ancestry says, this is what we're calling Scottish DNA.
Okay.
So when you do your DNA test, they're comparing your DNA against the groups. And then that's how they say, well, you're 30% Scottish because you have a 30% match with this group of super Scottish people. Their families are documented. We're sure about it. They've been here a long time. So you can see how for other like indigenous populations and of course like Black and African populations, this is a lot less accurate because these communities have been more mobile and they're much smaller. And so that group that Ancestry is using to call, just as an example, Native American DNA, it's a very small group of people. So it's not necessarily super accurate if somebody says, I got 20% Native American DNA. Well, that means you had a 20% match with like these 100 people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not super accurate. And, that's a whole other thing because I am a Cherokee citizen, but I have 0% Native American DNA according to Ancestry.com.
Interesting.
Because the way that also works with the ethnicity estimate and why it's not accurate for those types of groups is because of the way DNA is passed on from generation to generation. So, you get 50% from your mom and your dad, but you don't get a full and complete copy of your mom, half of your dad and half of your mom's DNA. Right. There are always parts of both of your parents' DNA that aren't passed down to you. And so you can see, especially like for Native Americans, who maybe, quote unquote, the last full blood person may have been generations ago, at each of those generational steps, that's a chance for that DNA to not be passed on. And so that's why, especially for Native American populations, the DNA is nearly meaningless. They've gotten more specific with it over the years. They've identified different like areas of Native American DNA, but it's still, there are no tribes, as far as I'm aware, that accept DNA status for citizenship or tribal membership because it's not the same thing. And really it's all made up. It doesn't exist. Yeah. No such thing as Native American DNA. There really isn't.
Right. That's so interesting. So does most of the like controversial part of that come from it being inaccurate and not very specific, or was there's something else along with that?
Well, just that, and that, that white people like to use their DNA results to claim membership to a group that they have no connection or rights to, particularly. If people who walk around and say, "Oh, I got 10% Native American on my Ancestry.com DNA, so now I'm a Native American." Well, no Native Americans say that you're Native American, and that's what matters, not your DNA test. There are plenty of white people who have African DNA. And that has also been used negatively by white people to try to claim some sort of African heritage, why you have that African DNA. And it's not because you were part of that culture. It was kind of the opposite of that. So, it can be used by, eugenicists and racists to, prop up a lot of their views. So it's something you have to take with a grain of salt, for sure.
Oh, definitely. That is all very interesting. And it seems like there's a lot of stuff in genealogy that kind of has to do with privilege. Like if your family has historically had more privilege, you're probably going to have more records and know more about your ancestry, which is really interesting.
That is extremely correct. Yes. I've done one tree for a white client where I just knew that the people were extremely poor and wasn't able to find many records on them, because if you think, people who are poorer are maybe more mobile, maybe they don't answer the door if someone comes to do the census or something like that. But, I've also done one Black tree for a Black client who was descended from enslaved people. And I knew going into that it would be a challenge, but it was a challenge in ways that I didn't expect. And that's what really opened my eyes was, I expected to hit those dead ends, those roadblocks. I expected to hit that on that tree around, 1870 or 1880, I would think, but what I found was that I hit those dead ends much earlier than that, like 1910, 1920. In some cases, I couldn't get past that. And because what makes it easy to identify a family throughout records over generations is seeing the family intact. And for this one client, it was very like he had multiple lines where there was families broken up, from census to census. And within 10 years, the family structure in the household was radically different. So that makes it very hard to track and follow people. It was shocking to me that I hit those brick walls so quickly on that tree. But yes, that's very much the case. And just like I said earlier, how the other flip side of that is English nobility charts
right.
have been published for centuries. If you can just Google that and find that on the internet, if you can plug in with that stuff. So yeah, it's all about who were the people that were on the records, and then were those records preserved, or, what did people do with those records after that?
That's really interesting. So are there any interesting people or stories that you have from researching your own genealogy?
Yes, funny that you should ask. Yes, I have a lot of interesting stories in my tree, which is probably why I got so interested in it in the first place, and so that's a little bit of my own privilege, that by virtue of the luck of the people that I happen to be descended from, it was interesting to me from a very young age. A more recent one that I found out not that long ago was on my mom's side. My great-grandfather was named Robert Lee Whitman, and he was from Louisiana. And my mom had never known any details about him because her father wasn't close with his father, because this would have been my mom's grandfather. So she never knew her grandfather really growing up at all. She had only heard stories from her father that his father was in law enforcement and had helped catch Bonnie and Clyde, was the story. And so that, that's one of those stories where I would say, yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
But turns out a couple of years ago, we didn't talk about this other source that is out there, newspapers.com. Newspapers are primarily on that site. And again, you have to pay for access to it. But I happened to have a newspapers.com subscription for a little while because I think I was using it I needed it for a client or something. And I thought, well, while I have this subscription, I'm gonna plug in every name in my tree and see what I can find. And so I started looking at him because I had always known that, this law enforcement career. What is this about? He might be in the papers, right? I found so much stuff in papers. Turns out he created the Louisiana Bureau of Identification, which is like this Louisiana version of the FBI, the state agency. Mm-hmm. He created that state agency in 1928. And then he also ran only the fourth statewide police radio network out of his house in Shreveport.
Wow.
There's a huge article about it in the paper. And then he was promoted to warden at Angola Prison in Louisiana by Huey P. Long, the little Louisiana governor you might have heard about. In 1934, he was warden at Angola. And I don't know if you know anything about Angola, but it is the state penitentiary in Louisiana and has a notorious history for being one of the most violent, basically like a plantation system in a prison. The chain gang idea, they had I think they called it the hot box, where they would put inmates in these, hot boxes in the Louisiana sun. So he was warden at Angola, at one of the most violent, notorious, racist prisons in American history, and apparently was a political appointee kind of guy, because after Huey Long was assassinated, he lost his position and completely disappears from the newspapers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there's still a lot more, and you can see how every little thing you learn, it makes you want to learn more, because now that I saw these newspaper articles, and he was also charged with corruption for basically, he invented the state agency, the state police bureau. Apparently he was taking most of that budget money and just pocketing it himself.
Interesting. Oh, man.
Which is par for the course in Louisiana politics in the 1930s, if you know anything about that. Yeah, it was very common. It was how they did business back then. But it just makes me feel like there have got to be more state records about this guy. And so that's kind of a bucket list item, is to maybe visit like Louisiana State Archives, try to find some police records. It seems like they've got to have something, because I would love to know, like, how exactly did he get that job? And I would like to know more about what he did as warden at Angola, because he was there when it was a very notorious time. Like, that is pretty much like the height of Angola's abuses as a racist, violent, like they had people working in the fields and chained up and all of that. There's just got to be more out there.
Yeah, for sure. Man, it's so interesting when you get like little snapshots of things, like not really someone's whole life, but just kind of like little bits and pieces.
Right. And you can build a story around that, but it's also, I like to sit with the mystery of it more, I think. And because then I can keep asking questions. My great grandfather, this Robert Lee Whitman, he's a good example because in his obituary that I found on newspapers.com, so this is like 2 or 3 years ago, I found this stuff. It mentions a second wife that we never knew about.
Oh, wow.
Another daughter that he had by this second wife. And this person could theoretically still be alive. So that's just an example of how he had a whole other life that nobody in my family knew about, because we didn't even know all this law enforcement stuff, all these details. This was all brand new to us. And then you think, there's probably some people still alive in Louisiana who might have known him or knew of his career. That knowledge just slips away so easily. And that's kind of the work of genealogy, is trying to uncover that again or make those connections again.
I've been meaning to, with this podcast and stuff, to like do more research into Native American history, like more specifically, because I feel like I've found little bits and pieces of things when I've tried to like pull apart people's like bad history takes or whatever and stuff like that. But like there's so much that I don't know, and so much that like as a country that we don't understand well about Native American history that I want to learn more about. And I know this is more like usual to you, but has there been like interesting things or moving things that you found, like specifically looking into like the Native American history part of your genealogy?
Yeah, so I'm a Cherokee citizen, and Chief John Ross, who was the longest serving chief of the Cherokee Nation and served during both removal and the Civil War, Chief John Ross is my 4-time great uncle. And so his youngest sister, Maria Ross, was my 4 times great grandmother. And that's a fact, I've known since I was a little girl. My family's known it since forever. And it's definitely one of those things that got me interested and excited about genealogy. But I have also learned a lot about Native American history just by digging further into my own tree. Because you can pick up a lot of books and read about John Ross. There's lots of books that have been written about him. But it's important to note like that part of Cherokee history is not typical, because the Rosses were basically like the 1% of the Cherokees. They were the wealthiest. They were, lots of Rosses were in many different positions in Cherokee government, and they owned enslaved people. And that's been well documented for a long time. But that's still even a thing that a lot of people don't know about Native American history, is that there were Native Americans who did own enslaved people, especially among what we call the 5 tribes, who were, primarily in the Southeast, and that it was a custom that they basically assimilated into, in terms of race-based slavery, in terms of it only enslaving Black people. But it was more common than a lot of people know. And also on that subject is that I'm also weirdly descended from free people of color who owned enslaved people, who would have been classified as quote unquote mulattoes in Louisiana around 1800 to about 1820. And there is history out there about that, and about these communities of free people of color who were also often intermarried with Native Americans. This group they were wealthy, and they owned enslaved people. And that's just another thing, like my tree has opened up all these questions for me. And I feel like I'll never have the time to actually read and study about these things, because I want to know what historians have to say about this, because I feel like there are so many of these weird like stories in my tree, and coming to it with my history background, I want to know the broader picture. What were these people's lives like, and how common were they, and what was that experience, and why did that even happen, and all these big questions. Maybe someday I'll get to some of that research. But I also came to think about my Native American ancestry very differently after I started working on my dad's tree, because like I said, I'd known since I was a little girl that we were descended from the Rosses. I'd also known since a little girl our blood quantum, because I'd seen my card and I knew that number, and it's small. And so because that number is small, I always felt not very Cherokee. And to be honest, I am white, but it is possible to be white and a Cherokee citizen. But in doing my dad's tree, which I started in 2012, so the Rosses is just like one line of my grandma's Cherokee ancestry. I came to find out that 3 of my grandma's four grandparents. 3 out of 4 of them were Cherokee and on the rolls. And it's those other 2 branches that aren't connected to the Rosses that we know much less about, and which is a much more common experience for Native Americans researching their ancestry. It is a myth when people say, oh, I think I'm Native American, but the records burned down, because the truth is Cherokees have kept excellent records for hundreds of years and have taken censuses. And I was able, and that's how I learned that about my grandma's family, is that it wasn't just the Rosses, but I found these other 2 branches on these Cherokee censuses. And putting this all into a tree and visualizing it, I mean, I could see that there's really nothing else that makes my grandma who she is. You know, that the whole reason my grandma's family came to be in Oklahoma is because she was Cherokee. And you can see the patterns of removal in your tree with, you know, where people are born. And, you know, like before 1838, they were born in Georgia or Tennessee. And after 1838, they were born in Arkansas or Oklahoma. And that's because of the Trail of Tears and removal. And just seeing that in my grandma's tree made me feel very differently about how Cherokee I am. Yeah, my Cherokee ancestors have been intermarried with whites for hundreds of years. But in terms of what is my grandma's actual background, is almost exclusively Cherokee, and then the free people of color side. And so it made me feel more Cherokee to get connected to my tree in that way, and to really also come to understand blood quantum, you know, as a tool of the colonizer, and that's not a way that Native Americans have ever self-identified themselves. You know, Cherokee culture was matrilineal. If your mother was Cherokee, you were considered Cherokee. You weren't considered half Cherokee only because your mother was full Cherokee. You were considered full Cherokee if your mother was any Cherokee. And so if you think about it that way, then, you know, the way I felt when I was younger, that knowing that I have a small blood quantum, that's just the colonizer, like, you know, infecting my brain since I was like 6.
Yeah.
You know, that's not the right way to think about it.
That's really interesting and so encouraging to like hear too. And I just like that. Okay, really the last question I have for you is, why is it important to study genealogy?
Well, yeah, kind of related to my answer to my last question, genealogy can become part of your identity. Genealogy can give you a family. Genealogy helps you imagine your ancestors as real people. And that's very humanizing, and it can make you feel better about your own life to think about your ancestors as full people who had struggles and had lived through crises, but still were normal people like you and me, who wake up every day and have a favorite color or have a favorite thing to eat for dinner or something like that. So I spend a lot of time lost in my head, daydreaming about my ancestors and thinking what they were like. And that can, for me, it's a great psychological thing to see yourself as part of a long continuum of people who survived, and that's why you're able to be here today. That can provide a lot of meaning in somebody's life. And not everybody sees it that way. And I definitely have friends and have had exes in the past who didn't care a lick about it. And some people just really aren't curious about genealogy at all. And it's fine, but because it's not for everybody and it doesn't have to be. But for some people, it can be very meaningful because it can help create your own identity. And I really do. I feel better about my life because I think of my ancestors as full people who had bad days and struggled just like I do. But I look back on them now and they become heroic. And it makes you feel like, you know, maybe you would be somebody's heroic ancestor in the future. You know, somebody knew the details about your life. Who knows what someone might imagine about you? And it's a way to kind of keep those people alive. And even, you know, going through this process, it's been very meaningful sharing this information with my parents who didn't know these things. And especially my dad now, I feel like he's more into being Cherokee than he ever was before because of what I've learned. And, you know, we talk about it regularly now and stay involved with the tribe. And I see how it's really done that for him and how that's been a change in his life just by knowing this information. So it can reconnect you to cultures and experiences and help you to imagine the past as a real thing.
That's beautiful. I love that.
I'm very passionate about it.
I love it.
Yeah, it is. It's a puzzle, and you learn something every time. And then it also is very meaningful. It's very fun to share what I learn with clients. Sometimes I'll host like a little "Who do you think you are" type of setup where I reveal information to them. And
dramatic.
Shock them with who they're related to. It's really fun.
That's so cool. I've been thinking more about like genealogy stuff lately. My grandfather wrote a book with a friend of his about his experience during World War II. Both of them. His friend is from Ukraine. My grandfather grew up in Iowa. And so they got
wow
and told their stories, which is really interesting. And he has like a couple paragraphs in the beginning of the book where he went back and talked about his parents and his dad's parents and his grandfather's parents. And I just was like, I never knew any of this information. And just, I didn't realize how exciting that was to like see their names. Like,
yes.
They came from Denmark, and I had no idea my ethnicity. Whenever I've talked about it with my parents, it's always just like, we're vaguely European. There's probably like 8 different countries with my ancestry. And so to have one at least that I know is so interesting and amazing. So
yeah, that kind of document is a gold mine. And that's something I don't have for any of my family. And I'm always so jealous of people who do have things like that have names in them that have been passed down over generations, or even like letters sometimes. Like, oh my gosh, if I had a letter from one of my ancestors, how cool would that be?
Yes.
But I don't have anything like that. So everything I know, I've had to dig out online, but it's incredible. That's incredible.
My grandfather too, his dad he wrote in a journal all the time. And so my grandfather has 50 years worth of my great grandfather's like journals and his experience. I know. It's so cool.
Oh my gosh.
He told me I'm the only one in our family that's interested in those.
Yeah. Well, see, that's usually the way it goes. It's usually, sometimes these things will just be sitting in a corner, and most people in the family are just like, whatever. But all it takes is like one person who is like, no, I'm very interested in that. And there's usually one person in the family. So it sounds like that person is you.
I think so. It's such an interesting thing. Thank you for
very cool
experience and the stories of that. It's really fun to hear about.
Thank you.
Like last thoughts or anything before we go?
Everybody should start their tree tonight. Get on Ancestry.com. Don't copy anybody else's tree. Work backwards from what you know. See how far you can get. And get to see those names and imagine their lives.
Thanks so much for coming on my podcast, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Adelaide. Thank you so much for having me.
So that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you so much for sleuthing with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're curious about this topic or want to follow Sarah on Twitter, I've linked everything in the description for you. Don't forget to follow History Sleuth on Twitter and wherever you get your podcasts, and rate and review when you can. I hope you have a great day. Bye!